Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of our podcast, At War. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to the last one on nuclear strategy. Today, we'll be talking about US foreign policy under the new Biden presidency in the context of South Asia. Our guest today is Ali Sultan. He is an international law expert, and he served as the executive director of RSIL from 2012 to 2016. He currently teaches at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, and he holds the JD from the University of Virginia Law School, where he also edited the Journal of Law and Politics. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Great to be with you, and many congratulations on this excellent venture, At War podcast.
Thank you. So I wanted to start off and talk about the new Biden presidency in the context of it being perhaps a continuation of Obama's era. So what implications will the new change in administration have? From the Obama administration, where we saw a massive increase in drone strikes, the central allocation of blame for the Afghan war on the Pakistani state, as well as a really counterintuitive emphasis on Pakistani importance. Recently, we saw Biden's statement to Hamid Karzai, where he said that Pakistan was 50 times more important than Afghanistan to America's regional interests. So what implications do you think that will have?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to realize is that the world is fundamentally a very different place than it was when during the Obama presidency. So the organizing principle of American policy at the time was counterterrorism, and Pakistan itself was at war with insurgents and militants. Now, as you know, we have turned the page, we have turned the corner, we have successfully overcome militancy in our borders. And of course, the mistrust which bedeviled this relationship during the Obama years was a byproduct of the war on terror, which was being waged with full urgency and ferocity at the time. Now, today, that's really not the organizing principle of US foreign policy. Now that principle really has shifted to what you could call global, what you could call great power competition, or GPC, which is that how should we deal with China going forward? So in a sense, the main issue from the world is no longer counterterrorism. It really is about managing this bilateral relationship that the US has with China, which is the most significant bilateral relationship in the world. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The fact that the world today is a completely different place than it was during the Obama presidency. And also the fact that Pakistan now, we ourselves have set a new tone in terms of our overall orientation towards foreign relations. Our singular focus no longer is on military security, but what we're trying to do is that we're enhancing the umbrella of national security to include also non-military security issues, which, of course, will be of immense interest to the Obama administration. Issues such as climate change, pandemic control. The overriding principle of our foreign policy going forward is not just going to be, as I said, military security, but also economic security. So the Foreign Office, the National Security Advisor, the Prime Minister, everybody these days is emphasizing on the fact that Pakistan should be seen as a geo-economic state rather than a state which is singularly seen through the prism of its geostrategic importance. Now that leads to your next question, to the sub part of your question, which is Afghanistan. Now things in Afghanistan are very delicately poised right now. As you know, one of the things which the Biden administration has done is that it has ordered a review of this agreement between the Trump administration and, of course, the Taliban, which was concluded about a year ago, 29th of February last year, whereby the US troops were supposed to draw down or withdraw, in fact, entirely from Afghanistan by May. Now, that is in a bit of a limbo right now. And we hope that the US will also realize that our leverage and our influence vis-a-vis certain actors in Afghanistan is limited. It's not unlimited. So, we can always, as they say, we can always take the horse to the water, but we can't make the horse drink that water. So Pakistan has been playing a positive, facilitative role in the whole Afghan peace process in the last 2 or 3 years, definitely since the Obama administration left about 4.5 years ago. And that has been acknowledged by the US. So I don't think that if the Biden administration is to respond to this on the basis of facts and truth, and that's also, I think, another thing that will change dramatically under the Biden administration. In the Trump administration, you saw a scattershot, randomized foreign policy being conducted, whimsically being conducted by the US. Now you would definitely see a more structured approach towards foreign relations, which of course adds predictability and subtlety as well to the entire system, which is good because the system becomes more, it's easier to set one's priorities within such a system, right? And the other important thing that will happen is that the Biden administration is going to be more respectful of truth and facts. So if you go by truth and facts, I don't think anybody can deny the positive role which Pakistan has been playing in the Afghan peace process. We want a prosperous, peaceful Afghanistan because, as I said, our entire focus is also going to be now geoeconomics. We would like, we would like to trade with Afghanistan. We would like better integration, better regional integration. And that's not possible unless there's peace in Afghanistan. But the world and the United States should also be mindful that there are spoilers to the Afghan peace process as well. You have ISIS, Khorasan, which has been regrouping in Afghanistan of late. And then, of course, we have our eastern neighbor, which feels a little left out, which has been feeling a little left out from the whole peace process. But ultimately, I think Pakistan realizes this, and I think the Biden administration will also realize that the fate of Afghanistan lies in the hands of the Afghan people. It's up to the Afghan people to lead and negotiate the way forward, which is peaceful. And that's a positive and a fruitful outcome for everybody involved. So those would be my preliminary points that I would like to make. And also this fact that truth, subtlety, no more in-your-face diplomacy is not going to be, it's not going to be in your face as we saw during the Trump administration. It's going to be a lot subtle. It's going to be fact-based, evidence-based. Many administration officials in the top positions, they've got all the platinum credentials that you can think about, including Secretary of State Blinken, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. He's a JD from Yale Law School. So it's a bunch of intelligent, reasonable, and rational-minded individuals at the top, which is a positive break from what we saw during the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, given that we hear so much about us living in a post-truth world, that you're saying this about the Biden administration, whereas so many people thought that Trump was really the true face of America, its truest face. And I think even President Assad of Syria said that about Trump, that he's the best one because he's the most transparent. But I wanted to go back to your point about Joe Biden and the movement away from terrorism. because his foreign policy approach has really been the counterterrorism plus approach. So relying on like a small special force contingent and then aggressive air power rather than like a large ground troop deployment. And we're seeing that in the Afghan peace deal. So he's saying that actually, no, I want to keep this special counterterrorism force behind. And we don't know yet what the Taliban will react to that, how they will respond to that. So also in terms of how Pakistan plays into this, when Biden as vice president and the Abbottabad raid happened, he was the only high-level US official who was against the idea, saying that, you know, Pakistan's status was a significant ally in the war next door. So having done that, having emphasized Pakistan's role, do you think that Biden will be relying on Pakistan more and more in the months to come, especially given Pakistan's significant role in the Afghan peace process?
Yes, for sure. Definitely when it comes to the security situation in Afghanistan, the US will certainly continue to rely on Pakistan, as it has been in the last 2 years or so, to essentially get this peace process over the line. But again, as I said, the US should realize that our bounties vis-a-vis the Taliban are limited, and they're not unlimited. So I wouldn't like both the countries to get into a situation where there's again this creeping mistrust between the two sides, which is what bedeviled this relationship during the Obama presidency. So I wouldn't like to see a repeat of that horror show. This trust which has been built in the last 2 or 3 years should continue into the future. But I do agree that Biden administration will certainly continue to rely on Pakistan to find a peaceful and enduring solution to the crisis, you know, as they call it, the never-ending war, the forever war in Afghanistan. But I would also like to emphasize that right now, Pakistan would not want the Biden administration to just deal with Pakistan through the prism of Afghanistan. Ideally, we would want this bilateral relationship to be much more comprehensive in terms of its scope. So we would, of course, want to engage with the US on trade and investment. We would like to engage with them on climate change. We would like to engage with them on pandemic control, global health, and also regional security. If there is one overriding concern which the US has vis-a-vis South Asia, it is to maintain regional stability, right? And regional stability means maintaining peace between India and Pakistan. The LOC a few years ago was described as the world's most dangerous border or frontier. So it is a nuclear flashpoint. And as you know, things in our eastern neighborhood in the last few years have upped the ante so much in the region in terms of potential aggression and so on and so forth. So I think that's also something which the Biden administration should focus on. Maybe try to play a part in resolving or trying to resolve the Kashmir dispute, trying their best to tamp down tensions between India and Pakistan to maintain that regional stability. So that's also something that we'd wish to see.
And moving to that, to its involvement in the region, we've seen that the new administration has already reached out to Modi in furtherance of Obama-era policy of repivoting to Asia away from the Middle East. As the Biden administration seeks to hem in China by relying on India and other regional bulwarks as like a stalwart, what can Pakistan do to leverage itself in this new arrangement?
Look, I think Pakistan has been very clear that it doesn't really want to come, in the crosshairs of this great power competition. Our foreign policy is just geared towards the welfare of our own citizens, the welfare and prosperity of our own citizens. So we want to stay clear of any great power competition. But it's correct that India and the US have been forging this strategic partnership in the last 2 decades or so. And the primary impetus behind that is to contain China. So India is a member of what's called the Quad, which also includes South Korea, Japan, and Australia. The US would expect these countries to essentially provide a balancing coalition against China's rise. Now, to what extent is India willing and able to do that is an open-ended question, because India traditionally has had this doctrine of strategic autonomy running through their foreign policy. And that, of course, is going to be challenged, and that is being challenged now when India has to pick one side. As far as Pakistan is concerned, I don't think we're going to be picking any sides. There's no compulsion on us to pick any side. And the structure of the international system is such now that we don't have a unipolar world anymore, but we've got 2 or 3 states. The US, of course, is still the most dominant power in the world, but China is not too far behind now, both militarily and economically. And Russia also, you could also include Russia as a resurgent great power. So there is multipolarity in the system. And it's not perhaps appropriate to compare the present multipolar moment or the multipolar structure of the world with the Cold War. So it's not necessarily going to be a zero-sum game moving forward. Countries can definitely adopt hedging strategies vis-a-vis US and China. And I think that's what we will do. You know that our bilateral relationship with China is historically very deep. It runs extremely deep, and it's full of trust as far as both the sides are concerned. There have never been really any trust issues. And of course, China has gone on and invested $60 billion through CPEC. And that's something that our economy, our country needs. We have a young population. 70% of our population is under the age of 30. So, it's necessary for us that that such investments, such economic initiatives are undertaken in Pakistan. So what we would actually like is to invite America to co-invest in CPEC projects or in other projects in Pakistan. One of the things that they can do is to get into economic partnerships with Pakistani firms, Pakistani businesses, and then produce and re-export products to China. Because if one of the things which this great power competition is going to do is that the US is going to try to alienate China economically, right? So if US businesses want access to Chinese market, one of the best ways of doing that is through re-exporting products from Pakistan and take advantage of the favorable trade agreement that Pakistan and China has. So there are all sorts of creative and innovative things that can be done as long as there is political will on both sides moving forward.
I wonder about that because the US has always been so opposed to China's Belt and Road Initiative and CPEC, in that it's always seen it as like a predatory trap for developing countries, whatever they get themselves involved in with China. And that is the reason for closer US and Indian ties. And we've seen that recently they've made all of these agreements with India on geospatial intelligence and logistics and stuff like that. And even apparently the Americans were giving India intel in the conflict in Ladakh against China. So do you think that there is, given Chinese threat as an economic power, do you think that we will see any kind of that political will from the Biden administration?
We might. Hope springs eternal, as they say. But you also have to understand there are some US presidencies which are defined by foreign relations. So you think of the Lyndon Johnson administration. It was entirely consumed by Vietnam War. You look at the George W. Bush administration, at least the his second tenure was entirely consumed by the Iraq War. The Biden administration has so much on its plate when it comes to domestic issues. Trumpism is very much alive. It's very much a potent political force in the U.S. The Democratic Party has a razor-thin majority in the Congress, and given the U.S. system of checks and balances, the president's executive powers are severely checked by the courts as well as the legislature. So that's the nature of the US system, right? So that's why if I were to crystal ball, and maybe if we were to have this conversation again after 4 years, just to review the first Biden presidency, the first tenure of Biden presidency. And now it's another matter whether there will be a second Biden presidency or not, which given his age and so on and so forth. So that also throws a lot of uncertainty. States right now are kind of adrift in terms of deciding definitively as to what to do, because they've had this experience for the last 4 years where the US, the credibility of the US has suffered immensely. So one of the challenges which the Biden administration is facing is to restore this credibility of the US. Now, that's a massive challenge. So even if there is political will, you have to understand that in terms of priorities, where would this priority lie for the Biden administration? Just within the foreign policy domain, which, of course, itself is perhaps going to play a second fiddle to the domestic issues that confront the Biden administration right now. A deeply polarized society, as you mentioned as well. There is perhaps a reasonable basis for saying that the US is facing an existential and identity crisis, certainly as far as cultural and social aspects are concerned. So that's why I think that one can always hope, one can always try diplomatically, of course, but maybe, whether something concrete comes from it or not, we shall see.
Yeah. It's just made me think of something that I recently read about Biden, which is that septuagenarians are not known for bringing about revolutions.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so it's just all of this, I want to be hopeful, but it does make you think about it in those terms. And I want to use that to talk then about his vice president now, Kamala Harris. So the extent to which we'll see her factoring, considering she is the recipient of the highest campaign donations made by the Indian diaspora to any candidate. So, and we know that the Indian diaspora is famously hawkish, and they have supported India's illegal annexation of Jammu and Kashmir. So will there be a Kamala Harris factor? We recently saw that there was a tweet which was taken down, which referred to Jammu and Kashmir as India's. And then it was posted again with a correction saying we meant that this is disputed territory. So will that be a factor?
Okay. Look, if there ever were to be a Kamala Harris factor, was essentially, I think, eviscerated in the aftermath of these tweets by her niece on the farmers' protest, Meena Harris. And there were posters of her which were being burnt on the streets in Delhi, and then she later on tweeted, saying how spooky it feels that these strangers are just burning my effigies and posters. So I think that's the defining image of India, which the Harris family now has in their minds. And also another thing, Kamala Harris associates herself more with the Black community of the US. I mean, she was given the ticket not because of her South Asian ancestry, but because of her representation as a Black woman, as a woman of color. And that's how she grew up as well. That's how her mother even raised her. So, that's why I don't think that she's going to be particularly influential. And in any case, the vice presidency, someone once famously, one of the vice presidents, I think it was Johnson, or maybe Spiro Agnew, one of the two, who famously called vice presidency as a pitcher of warm spit. So I don't know how much of an influence the vice president plays to begin with. And the other thing is, there have been several members of Pakistani diaspora in the United Kingdom, for example, who have risen to even higher, to as high positions as Kamala Harris. So you had the Right Honorable Sajid Javed, who was until recently the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK. We've had the Mayor of London, who was... So they think like UK citizens and nationals. Kamala Harris is a US citizen and national. And to her, it's American interests which matter, because at the end of the day, she's answerable to American voters. So... as they say, Ghalib famously said, "Dil ko khush rakhne ko ye khayal acha hai Ghalib." So, in terms of feeling good about her ancestry, I'm sure some people might exult about that in India, but the fact of the matter is that it was essentially evaporated the moment Meena Harris was so viscerally attacked by the Hindu nationalists. So, also some other officials now that we're talking about Modi and the forces of majoritarianism and nationalism, which he has unleashed. Some other officials in the Biden administration have been extremely skeptical of Modi. They've written about it. In fact, the new director of the CIA, William Burns, when he was the president of Carnegie Endowment for Peace, he wrote an article when Modi was campaigning for Trump in the Howdy Modi rally in Texas. So at the time he wrote this article, it's still available on the web. Anybody can access it. And it's highly critical of Modi and his lurch towards authoritarianism and majoritarianism. So that's one. Anthony Blinken also knows the region very well, as does Jake Sullivan. And these are not people whom you can fool for too long. So this image that perhaps this soft image that India has tried to project, might have worked during the Trump administration, but it's going to come increasingly under criticism, under scrutiny, now in the US as well as globally. Because again, you have to link it with what I said earlier, which is that generally speaking, truth now is going to be fashionable again, which was not the case. So a lot of this image building, which India has done, hasn't really been based on facts. There's a lot of fantasy. There's a lot of make-believe that goes on behind that. Whereas the reality is, recently there was an article in Time magazine which said that how long can India go on pretending that it is a democracy? And, the first call which Biden made to Modi, well, first of all, the call to Prime Minister Modi was the 19th call that he made to any head of government. So that means that he was 19th on the list. The first foreign policy statement which Joe Biden made as the president, with Anthony Blinken on his side, he mentioned almost all his allies, but there was no mention of India, right? The incoming U.S. representative to the United Nations, when she was asked at her confirmation hearings whether U.S. supports UN Security Council permanent membership for India or not, she was non-committal about that, which is moving away from the US's earlier position.
Right.
So you have to look at all of these things as a whole, and not really focus on these ethnic issues. They might make us exult here in South Asia, but that's not how the US works or how the US political system works.
Yeah, you've talked a lot about Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And we know that he's been a long-time Biden confidant, and he's been accused by several policy analysts of being wrong about every foreign policy decision over the past 2 decades. So we're talking about Iraq, Syria, and Libya. He's always been on the wrong side. So will the return of this Biden-Blinken nexus signal the return of America's long-degraded neo-imperialist policy, as well as the deep state in general?
Well, I hope not. Blinken he's extremely suave, but again, you have to understand that in the last 4 years, the State Department has been gutted so much by Donald Trump that there are teething capacity issues at the State Department itself. So I'm not too sure whether the State Department will be playing as outsized role as it traditionally has in U.S. foreign policy making as well as implementation. There are other actors as well. Secretary of Defense, you have the National Security Advisor, you have the National Security Council, President Biden himself. And he may also seek advice from some of his close confidants, such as John Kerry, who he has appointed as the envoy on climate change. So Blinken is not going to be singularly responsible for foreign policy decisions or choices. And I would hope that, maybe this time around, now that he is the Secretary of State, very well educated, very suave, and I hope that, this time maybe he makes the right calls, because that's what the world needs at this point. Sure, it's fine that the multipolar structure of the world demands some kind of competition. There's this argument called the Thucydides trap that's made by Graham Allison about the inevitability of great power competition. So we are in that moment. We are in that historical moment right now. But it doesn't mean that it has to end in some kind of a catastrophe. So I would like to see both China and the US and Russia and other strong powers in the world playing a more responsible role, more respectful of international law than we saw in the last 4 years. Because, again, one of the key Biden administration officials, his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, he wrote an article about a year back in the Foreign Affairs magazine that I think sums it up very nicely, which says that competition, like the title is, competition, not catastrophe. So competition is inevitable, but there are definitely areas of convergence as far as China and the US are concerned. And one of those areas of convergence is maintaining peace and strategic stability in South Asia. That is why I'd like to go back to my earlier point and stress that regional peace in South Asia, as well as resolution of the Jammu and Kashmir dispute, should be high on the agenda of the Biden administration. And this is, this is one of those convergences, one of those areas, global areas of concern, in addition to others also. For example, North Korea, China and the US will have to collaborate on that. Climate change, China and the US will have to collaborate on that. Other areas as well, global pandemic. We saw that the Trump administration had this unilateralist impulses, but one thing that we would see, and Blinken believes in that heavily, is multilateralism, is this return to multilateralism. So we're already witnessing the US re-engaging with multilateral institutions. That's positive for all internationalists as well as those who believe in international law. So I think that's really going to be the defining challenge, global challenge in the next 4 years. which is how is the China and the US relationship going to play itself out. And as I said, I would hope and I would agree with with Biden's national security advisor that sure, there's going to be competition, but competition should not mean catastrophe.
Yeah.
In fact, there should be areas of convergence and collaboration moving forward as well.
And we did even discuss the Thucydides trap with Ijaz Heather on the last podcast in the context of the US and China, viewing China as that, and also China viewing India as that as well. And I think it will be interesting going forward to see whether the US views China as a competitor or an adversary. And maybe we'll see that playing out in the South China Sea or areas of contention between these two countries.
Sure. I think the Indo-Pacific in general is a higher area of priority for the US than South Asia.
Yeah.
If you were to prioritize, even the partnership that they have with India, it's more Indo-Pacific centric or focused. Like Quad is Indo-Pacific rather than being focused on South Asia. So South Asia has its own regional dynamics. Where, of course, Afghanistan, the Afghan issue, is central, and of course, the most important South Asian relationship happens to be India and Pakistan, and that's what I've been, that's what I've been repeatedly saying needs to be addressed, and the U.S. Should, perhaps more actively manage this brewing crisis. Since 5th August 2019. And since we're talking about South Asia, we should also not forget what's going on in Myanmar, right?
Yeah.
As you know, recently there was a coup, and the Biden administration has been very assertive in terms of demanding a return to democracy, which also fits in with the overall with the overall agenda which Biden has, which is to promote liberal democratic values as much as American pragmatism would allow. So that's also important for us because, again, the whole relationship with India is based on this shared, commitment to liberal values. And those are the values which are being eroded in India. So that's why I think that the Biden administration, if not so overtly, would definitely, behind the scenes, will apply pressure on India to put an end to some of the human rights violations that have been going on. And in that context, I think it's also important to remember that when Obama was the president and he visited India in 2015, he was the guest of honor at their Republic Day celebrations. But just for 3 days, he just remained quiet on the worsening of fundamental freedoms and civil liberties in India. But his parting shot, just before he left, when he was addressing students, like a younger crowd, he was very clear that India's economic future is dependent on its tolerance for religious freedom. And that is something we have seen, rapidly erode in India in the last 4 years, especially during the second term of Modi. And there are many people in the Biden administration which were also part of the Obama administration. That's why I think that the Biden administration will certainly bring up these issues with India, maybe not so overtly, but definitely behind closed doors, right?
Yeah, I think that you're putting a lot of faith in these suave, well-educated professionals. But it just reminds me of something. We had a webinar where Dan Kovalik was discussing his book, and in his book he was talking about the fact that Ivy Leaguers make the best war criminals because they're the ones who can defend their ideas incredibly articulately and eloquently. And he was talking in particular about Samantha Power, who, I mean, he takes her down massively in his book.
Right.
And I kind of
Samantha
feel
Power is now back as the head of the USAID.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
But look, there has been an argument going back since the times of Socrates, that what is sophistry and what is true knowledge. So this is a never-ending debate. Perhaps you could say that Ivy League and platinum education does make you silver-tongued, but I would still trust them perhaps more than I would trust someone like someone boorish as Donald Trump. But I can see your point. I mean, the Germans were massively educated. It was known as the empire of the mind. Some of the best philosophers have been Germans, and yet they ended up perpetrating the most brutal Holocaust in history. So education does not necessarily wipe out your impulses for power, your impulses for greed, and so on and so forth. But I would like to see the cup, half full rather than half empty, and remain hopeful on that.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of my heroes, who's from my law school, Robert Kennedy, is the great liberal icon, and Biden also looks up to him. So maybe that's why I'm hopeful.
Okay.
And Biden is not Ivy League educated, by the way.
Yeah, he's not.
So maybe he's
there's
suave
some hope.
enough, minus the platinum credentials. So let's give him a pass on that.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here with us today. This is such an interesting discussion. And thank you everyone for tuning in at home. And we hope that you'll tune in for our future episodes. Goodbye.